The thing about being humanity's first representative to the Galactic Council is that nobody tells you how much it feels like your first day at a new school if that school was run by condescending octopi and had filing cabinets that occasionally ate people. My name is Jack Murphy, and this is how I accidentally turned the entire galactic bureaucracy upside down. Spoiler alert, it involves coffee, chaos, and a whole lot of paperwork. Let me paint you a picture of my first day. The council chamber is this massive crystal dome floating above what looks like a sea of liquid mathematics. Real fancy stuff. The kind of architecture that screams we're so advanced, we've forgotten what chairs are supposed to look like. No joke, my first diplomatic faux pas was trying to sit on what turned out to be Ambassador Flutix's ceremonial third cousin twice removed. The council members themselves. Picture the most diverse group of beings you can imagine, then make them all wear the same expression of barely concealed superiority. There's Ambassador Cracks from the Silicon Consciousness, who looks like a desktop computer had a baby with a chandelier. Then there's High Counselor Meep, yes, actually named Meep, who resembles a very disappointed cloud of sparkly gas. Welcome. Representative of Earth Meep's voice resonated through the chamber, managing to sound both ethereal and like they were talking to a particularly slow child. We are most fascinated by your survival despite your planet's clearly hostile conditions. I smiled my best diplomatic smile, the one I practiced in the mirror for weeks. Thank you, High Counselor. We're pretty attached to our death world, hostile conditions and all. That got some tentacle clutching from the aquatic delegates. Apparently, calling Earth a death world is fine when they do it, but when we do it, it's concerning and requires immediate psychological evaluation. The real fun started when they brought out the paperwork. Did you know that in galactic standard bureaucracy, there are 73 different forms just to acknowledge that you exist? And that's not counting the appendices, addendums, and what I'm pretty sure was a grocery list that got mixed in somewhere around Form 46. Now then, chirped Administrator Zorblaks, a being who looked like origami gone wrong and had the personality of a filing cabinet with aspirations. We'll need you to fill out Form X789Q4, acknowledging that your species' continued existence is an statistical improbability and therefore potentially offensive to the natural order. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? Standard procedure Zorblaks continued, producing more forms from somewhere, followed by Form Y235D, confirming that you understand that your response to Form X789Q4 may be held against you in future philosophical debates. That's when I made my second diplomatic faux pas of the day. I laughed. Not a polite chuckle, mind you, but a full-blown, earth-shattering guffaw that had several crystalline beings checking themselves for cracks. The chamber went silent. The kind of silence that usually precedes either a major diplomatic incident or someone trying to sell you life insurance. I failed to see the humor in standard bureaucratic procedures, Zorblak said, managing to sound both offended and intrigued, quite a feat for someone whose face was basically geometric shapes having an argument. Sorry, I said, not feeling sorry at all. It's just, on Earth we have a saying, I reject your reality and substitute my own. I paused for dramatic effect. Also, I'm pretty sure that form you're holding is upside down. The chaos that ensued when several council members rushed to check their own form's orientation was my first clue that maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't the only ones winging it in this vast bureaucratic universe. And that, my friends, was just the first hour of my first day. Little did I know that by the end of the week I'd end up causing an interstellar incident involving coffee, challenging the fundamental principles of galactic governance, and teaching a hive mind how to play poker. But those are stories for another form. Time. Welcome to galactic politics, where the rules are made up and the points don't matter but the paperwork. The paperwork is eternal. It was during my third week of navigating the galactic bureaucratic maze that I stumbled across Form ZZ999-0, innocently tucked between a requisition for non-Euclidean paperclips and what appeared to be a takeout menu from the Fifth Dimension Cafe. The form's title read Classification Protocol, Protected Preservation of Pre-Enlightened Species and Their Native Habitats. Now, I may not be the brightest star in the galaxy, but even I could read between the lines, especially when those lines were literally spelling out Earth is to be converted into a cosmic petting zoo. Ah, Representative Murphy Zorblax materialized behind me with the silent efficiency of a printer running out of ink just when you need it most. I see you've found our preliminary preservation proposal. Most species consider it an honor to be classified as a protected preserve. The paperwork is already 87.3% complete. I turned to face Zorblax, whose geometric face had rearranged itself into what I assumed was a smile, though it looked more like a triangle having an existential crisis. An honor, I repeated slowly, to be treated like an endangered species in our own solar system. Precisely, Zorblax's edges gleamed with satisfaction. The Council has determined that any species capable of surviving on a death world must be preserved for scientific study. We've prepared a mere 1,247 forms for your signature to begin the process. And if we refuse? The question caused several nearby floating data pads to crash into each other. Zorblax's angles became distinctly more acute. Refuse. But that's not in the procedures. There's no form for refusal. The very concept is. They paused, producing a small paper bag which they proceeded to hyperventilate into. That's when I met Ping. Picture a being that looks like a cross between a librarian and a disco ball, with tentacles made of what appears to be pure information. She floated over, her crystalline surface reflecting my increasingly annoyed expression. You'll have to excuse Zorblax, Ping whispered, her voice sounding like pages being rapidly flipped. The last time someone questioned the system, they had to create a new filing dimension. She glanced around conspiratorially. Between you and me, some of us think the preservation protocol is a bit outdated. I stood up, my chair making an ominous screech against the quantum crystalline floor. Several council members winced at the sound. Outdated? It's practically prehistoric. And I don't mean that as a compliment, considering you folks have actual prehistoric beings on staff in the Temporal Affairs Department. Representative Murphy Zorblax had recovered enough to resume their bureaucratic monotone. Perhaps you're experiencing death world-induced cognitive stress. I've taken the liberty of preparing Formax 567P for mandatory psychological evaluation. That's when I did something that would later be recorded in the Council archives as the first sign of Deathworlder instability. I started organizing the paperwork. Not filing it, oh no, I was organizing it into elaborate paper airplanes. What? What are you doing? Zorblax's voice rose to a frequency that made several crystalline beings develop cracks. Testing aerodynamic properties of your forms, I replied calmly, launching a perfect paper airplane made from a notice of intent to notice form. It soared gracefully across the chamber before landing in the ceremonial fountain of eternal documentation, causing the sacred ink to splash onto several nearby bureaucrats. The chaos that followed was beautiful. Zorblax began reciting regulation numbers in binary. 3 different emergency protocol committees spontaneously formed and immediately began arguing over which committee had jurisdiction over committee formation protocols. Ping, meanwhile, was trying very hard to look disapproving while secretly recording everything with what appeared to be her equivalent of a phone. This is unprecedented, Zorblax finally managed to sputter. The forms. They're meant to be filed, not folded. This is a direct violation of subsection 7, paragraph 4.2 of the Sacred Guidelines of Paper Management. I stood my ground. Another paper airplane at the ready. Here's the thing about humans, Zorblax. We have this funny habit of questioning systems that don't make sense. And you know what doesn't make sense? Trying to turn our planet into a cosmic wildlife preserve without even asking us first. But the forms. We'll have to wait, I interrupted, launching my final paper airplane, this one made from the preservation proposal itself. It executed a perfect loop-de-loop before landing on High Councillor Meep's gaseous head, where it slowly dissolved into the void. Because Earth isn't some quaint specimen for your galactic museum. We're a species that survived and thrived on what you call a death world. And if you think we did that by blindly following rules that don't make sense, well, you clearly need to update your databases. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ping's quiet applause, and what might have been Zorblax's geometry quietly rearranging itself into a crisis response pattern. And that, my friends, was how the Great Paperwork Revolt began. Though if you think this was chaos, just wait until they discover what happens when you introduce coffee to beings who've never experienced caffeine before. Looking back, I probably should have given more thought to the implications of introducing an alien council to humanity's favorite psychoactive substance. But in my defense, I was running on 3 hours of sleep and my sixth cup of coffee when I had what I now call the incident. It started innocently enough. I was in my office, really more of a repurposed quantum storage closet, reviewing the 500th form denying Earth's classification as a preserve, when Ping drifted in. "What's that aroma?" she asked, her crystalline surface rippling with curiosity. "It's like someone liquefied excitement." I glanced at my trusty Earth-made coffee maker, the only piece of human technology I'd been allowed to bring after it passed 72 safety inspections and was officially classified as a Class A-free chemical reaction containment unit. "This just coffee. Humanity's gift to consciousness." I took a long sip, watching as Ping's surfaces reflected the steam in fascinating patterns. "Want to try some?" Now, in my defense, I had submitted the proper forms for sharing Earth-based consumables. Form F789B, intent to share non-lethal consumables with Council members. Form RT456Q, acknowledgement of potential chemical reactions in non-standard biological systems. I even filled out the ridiculously specific Form ZX111O, permission to potentially alter colleagues' state of consciousness through mutually agreed upon substance exchange. What I hadn't counted on was Ping's enthusiasm for new experiences and her extensive social network. Within hours, the council chamber had transformed into what I can only describe as a galactic coffeehouse. Ping had shared her discovery with her friend in quantum analytics, who told the entire Department of Temporal Paradox Resolution, who then informed the Committee for New Experience Classification, and so on. High Councillor Meep, it turns out, becomes incredibly chatty when caffeinated. Their usual cloud of dignified gas had taken on the appearance of a cosmic lightning storm, and they wouldn't stop talking about their collection of quantum poetry. But have you really thought about the metaphysical implications of knock-knock jokes they were asking anyone who would listen? The existential duality of presence and absence, all wrapped in a simple questioning of who's there. Zorblax, meanwhile, was experiencing what they later termed a geometric awakening. Their usually rigid angles had become surprisingly fluid, and they were reorganizing the entire filing system by color, mood, and vibrational resonance with the universal filing consciousness. The fawns, they exclaimed, zipping around the chamber at unprecedented speeds. They're not just fawns, they're a medium of artistic expression. Why did we never see it before? Look at this requisition for temporal paradox insurance. It's practically interpretive dance in bureaucratic form. That's when Administrator Vex from Species Classification walked in. Picture, if you will, a being that looks like a very serious octopus wearing what appears to be a tweed jacket made of light, stopping dead in their tentacles at the sight of the Council's highest members experiencing their first caffeine high. What they demanded, all 8 eyes blinking in synchronization, is the meaning of this chaos. I cleared my throat, just introducing some colleagues to a traditional Earth beverage. A beverage. Vex's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You mean to tell me that humans regularly consume this substance?" "Oh yes," Ping chimed in, her surfaces now vibrating at a frequency that was making nearby datapads spontaneously reorganize their files. "And it's magnificent. Did you know you can actually feel colors? I understand why they survived on a death world. Now they've been training with this miracle elixir." Vex's tentacles curled in horror. "You mean to tell me that humans not only survived on a death world but did so while regularly consuming mind-altering substances for pleasure?" "Well, when you put it that way," I shrugged, taking another sip of my coffee. "Would you like to try some?" The look of sheer terror that crossed Vex's features was almost worth the 17 new forms they immediately generated for regulation of consciousness-altering substance distribution in council spaces. The next day, coffee was officially classified as a Class A restricted substance, right alongside antimatter and tax exemption forms. Unofficially, I became the most popular person in the council, with a steady stream of visitors to my quantum closet office asking in whispered tones if I had any more of the Earth drink. But the real kicker, the council had to create an entirely new classification category for humanity. Because how do you categorize a species that not only survives on a death world but does so while deliberately consuming substances that alter their consciousness, all while maintaining enough sanity to create elaborate bureaucratic revenge schemes involving paper airplanes? As Ping put it, While helping me fill out the incident reports, perhaps we should be less worried about preserving humanity and more worried about what humanity might do to preserve itself. She had a point. And she hadn't even tried espresso yet. You know that moment when you realize the bureaucratic nightmare you're dealing with might actually be concealing something sinister? That's where I found myself after the coffee incident, buried in what Ping cryptically called the archives that don't exist. Picture a room that makes the infinity of space look cozy, endless rows of quantum archived data stretching in directions that probably haven't been invented yet. Ping's domain. Her actual title was Interdimensional Information Interface Coordinator. But I preferred to call her the galaxy's most dangerous librarian. The Council, Ping whispered, her crystalline surfaces dim to near darkness, has a pattern of preserving species they don't understand. Look at this. She projected a series of images into the space between us. The Chrysalis Collective, a civilization of sentient butterflies, preserved. The Quantum Dancers of Nexus VII, preserved. The Silicon Dreamers, preserved. All of them now nothing more than carefully maintained exhibits in various corners of the galaxy. They're going to try to quarantine Earth, she said, her voice crackling with static. Emergency Protocol 42Z. They've already started the paperwork. But they can't just. I started, before Ping's tentacle of pure information covered my mouth. They can and they will. The coffee incident gave them the perfect excuse. Unstable species prone to creating and distributing consciousness-altering substances. The quarantine orders are being processed as we speak. That's when Zorblax materialized from between two filing cabinets, causing both of us to jump. Well, I jumped. Ping sort of rippled violently. Representative Murphy, they said. Their geometric patterns arranged in what I'd learned to recognize as their strictly business configuration. I have here Form QT 789 Notice of Impending Planetary Quarantine. Your signature is required, though purely as a formality. I took the form, making a show of reading it carefully. Interesting. And what happens if I don't sign? Then Form QT 790 automatically goes into effect, acknowledgement of refusal to acknowledge quarantine, which initiates the quarantine anyway. Zorblax's edges gleamed with bureaucratic satisfaction. You know what's funny about that? I said, casually folding the form into an increasingly complex shape. It reminds me of another form I found in the archives. Something about the Chrysalis Collective. Form CC 404, final warning before preservation. Zorblax's geometry suddenly became very irregular. Those archives are sealed. Are they? I continued folding. Because I have to wonder, how many species have you preserved just because they didn't fit into your neat little categorical boxes? How many civilizations are sitting in cosmic display cases because they made you uncomfortable? The preservation protocols exist for the greater good, Zorblax insisted, though their angles were becoming distinctly less confident. Species that demonstrate unpredictable behaviors. You mean species that think for themselves? Ping interrupted, her surfaces flashing with barely contained anger. Species that might challenge the way things have always been done. I finished folding the quarantine form. It now resembled an elaborate origami phoenix. You know what humans call it when you lock something away and only let people look at it through glass? A prison. This is outrageous. Zorblax was practically vibrating now. The Council will hear of this breach of. The Council will hear everything, I agreed, pulling out my data pad. Including the archived footage I found of the last 12 species you preserved. Tell me, does the general public know that the quantum dancers didn't actually dance themselves into extinction? That they were forced into their current eternal performance state? The silence that followed was heavy enough to have its own gravitational pull. You wouldn't, Zorblax whispered. Try me. I set my origami phoenix on the nearest filing cabinet. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take this information to the Council, all of it. Every preserved species, every forced quarantine, every false report. Or I will. And I'll do it my way, which involves a lot more coffee and considerably less regard for proper filing procedures. The system exists for a reason, Zorblax protested, but their voice had lost its bureaucratic certainty. The system exists because you're afraid, Ping said softly. Afraid of species that don't follow your rules. Afraid of change. Afraid of what might happen if you let diversity truly flourish in the galaxy. I nodded. And you know what humans do with systems that don't work? We break them. Then we build better ones. But the forms will be reformed, I finished. See what I did there? Little bureaucratic humor for you. Ping's surfaces rippled with what might have been a suppressed laugh. You have one standard galactic day, I continued. Either you bring this to the council, or I do. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens when I've had enough coffee to fuel a full presentation on bureaucratic corruption. Zorblax looked from me to Ping, then to the origami phoenix, which had somehow started glowing slightly. This will cause chaos, they said finally. Sometimes chaos is necessary for growth, Ping responded. Isn't that right, Representative Murphy? I smiled, reaching for my coffee thermos. Chaos? In my experience, that's just the universe's way of filing things under interesting developments. As Zorblax fled, presumably to begin preparing the mountain of paperwork this would require, Ping turned to me. You do realize this means war? The bureaucratic kind. Good thing I brought extra coffee, then I pulled out a second thermos. By the way, have you ever heard of something humans call malicious compliance? I think you're going to love it. And that's how Operation Preservation Liberation began. Armed with caffeine, righteousness, and an archivist who knew where all the bodies were metaphorically buried, we prepared to take on the greatest bureaucracy in the galaxy. Though honestly, the paperwork for starting a revolution was surprisingly straightforward. Just had to file it under S for systemic reform, rather than R for revolution. Sometimes the best way to beat a system is to know exactly how to work it. The thing about bureaucracies is that they're like those massive gas giant planets, impressive from a distance, but mostly full of hot air once you get close enough. And after weeks of studying every regulation, statute, and bylaw in the Council's archives, thanks to Ping's unlimited access and an unhealthy amount of coffee, I found exactly what we needed: Form UX 400-40, Declaration of Bureaucratic Error Due to Circular Logic. The Council chamber was packed for what they thought would be a standard preservation protocol hearing. The preserved species representatives were there too, though they didn't look very represented, more like carefully arranged museum pieces. The sight made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. Mostly. Representative Murphy, High Councillor Meep began, their gaseous form looking particularly condescending today. We are gathered to formalize Earth's preservation status. Point of order, I interrupted, holding up Form UX 400-40. According to Statute 7, subsection 12, paragraph 3 of the Council's founding documents, no action can be taken if it creates a logical paradox within existing bureaucratic frameworks. Zorblax, who had been unusually quiet since our archive encounter, suddenly developed what looked like geometric anxiety. What paradox? I smiled. The kind of smile that makes insurance salespeople nervous. Well, let's see. According to Form RT 789, a species can only be preserved if they're deemed incapable of handling advanced galactic concepts, correct? Correct, Meep confirmed, starting to look less gaseous and more worried. And according to Form LP 456, the ability to navigate and manipulate council bureaucracy is considered one of the most advanced galactic concepts. Yes. Several council members began shifting uncomfortably in their non-Euclidean seats. Therefore, I continued, pulling out a stack of forms that Ping had helped me prepare by successfully filing these 342 interconnected appeals, 16 regulatory challenges, and 1 application for a parking permit which, by the way, created a new subspace parking lot. I have demonstrated humanity's mastery of your most advanced systems. Thus, by your own regulations, we cannot be preserved because we're too advanced to qualify for preservation. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ping trying very hard not to laugh and what might have been Zorblax's geometry having an existential crisis. But Administrator Vex sputtered, all 8 eyes blinking rapidly. The forms weren't meant to be used that way. Oh really? I pulled out another document. Show me where it says that. Because according to Form RL 111 Guidelines for Interpreting Guidelines, any limitation not explicitly stated in the original documentation cannot be retroactively applied without filing Form RL 112 through RL 999 in triplicate with approval from a committee that, according to these records, won't exist for another 300 years. This is unprecedented, someone shouted from the back. No, I corrected them. This is humanity. We survived on a death world not by being the strongest, or the fastest, or or even the smartest. We survived because we're the best at adapting, at finding ways around problems we can't solve head-on. You look at rules and see absolutes. We look at rules and see guidelines open to creative interpretation. I stood up, addressing the entire chamber. And you know what else we're good at? Saying no. No to arbitrary restrictions. No to being put in boxes, metaphorical or literal. No to systems that preserve order at the cost of growth and change. The chamber erupted in chaos. Several crystalline beings developed stress fractures. At least 3 committees spontaneously formed to address the crisis, then immediately began arguing about which committee had jurisdiction over crisis-related committee formation. Order Meep tried to restore calm. We must have order. Why, I asked simply. Because it's comfortable. Because it's always been that way. Look around this chamber. Look at the species you've preserved. Every one of them had something unique to offer, something that didn't fit your neat categories. And instead of adapting your system to include them, you adapted them to fit your system. I walked over to the preserved representatives, their forms barely moving in their containment fields. This isn't preservation. This is fear. Fear of change, fear of difference, fear of everything that makes the galaxy actually worth exploring. Ping floated forward, her surfaces reflecting every face in the chamber. He's right. I've watched for centuries as we reduce the infinite diversity of the cosmos to a filing system. Enough is enough. So here's humanity's response to your preservation protocol, I announced, pulling out one final form. Form No. 001 Declaration of Intent to Respectfully Decline, while simultaneously suggesting the Council reconsider its entire existence. That's not a real form, Zorblaks managed to sputter. It is now, I replied, stamping it with what might have been unnecessary force. I just filed it, in triplicate. And that's how humanity became the first species to not just say no to the Council, but to do it with properly filed paperwork. In the end, it wasn't the rejection of the preservation protocol that changed everything. It wasn't even the revelation of the Council's questionable collection of preserved species. No, what really threw the galactic bureaucracy into a tailspin was Form Co. 001, humanity's counteroffer for galactic integration, or how we learn to stop worrying and love the chaos. Picture, if you will. The Council chamber 3 days after the famous no speech. The preservation fields had been deactivated. The Chrysalis Collective was stretching its wings for the first time in centuries. The quantum dancers were teaching younger species how to move between dimensions through interpretive dance. And there I stood, with Ping by my side and a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, about to propose something ridiculous. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of indefinable existence, I began, humanity would like to apply for a new position within the Council Department of Creative Solutions and Controlled Chaos. The silence that followed was broken only by what sounded like Zorblaks dropping an entire filing cabinet somewhere in the back. You want to institutionalize chaos, High Councillor Meep's gaseous form swirled in confusion. Not chaos, I corrected. Creative problem solving. Look, you've spent millennia building the most efficient bureaucracy in the galaxy. But efficiency without flexibility is just another form of entropy. You need someone to find the loopholes, test the boundaries, and occasionally throw a wrench in the works, professionally of course. With proper forms filed in triplicate. And coffee, Ping added helpfully. Don't forget the coffee. And coffee, I agreed. Which, by the way, is no longer classified as a restricted substance but rather as a cognitive enhancement and social lubricant aid. The paperwork was filed this morning. The Council erupted into discussion. The quantum dancers performed what looked like an interpretive representation of bureaucratic evolution. The Chrysalis Collective created a stunning chrysalis pattern that somehow spelled out vote yes in 17 different languages. But the system, Zorblaks began. We'll adapt, I finished. Just like humanity did on our Deathworld. Just like every species in this room could if given the chance. The universe isn't neat and orderly, it's wild and wonderful, and sometimes you need to improvise. And you think humanity is qualified to manage this improvisation? Administrator Vex asked, their tentacles tying themselves in contemplative knots. I grinned. We survived and thrived on a planet that tries to kill us on a regular basis by coming up with solutions no one else would think of. We turned beans into a productivity-enhancing beverage that half the Council is now secretly addicted to. And we just revolution-hacked your bureaucracy using your own paperwork. I'd say we're uniquely qualified. The vote that followed was the first unanimous decision in council history, mostly because everyone was too curious to see what would happen to vote against it. And that's how, 1 year later, the Department of Creative Solutions and Controlled Chaos became the most popular division in the council. Our waiting list for consultations is currently scheduled out to the heat death of the universe, but we're working on some creative solutions for that. The preserved species? They're all free now, teaching the council things they never knew they needed to learn. The Chrysalis Collective runs an art therapy program for stressed bureaucrats. The Quantum Dancers established an interdimensional transportation network that works on interpretive dance principles. Even Zorblax joined our department as head of regulatory reinterpretation, though they still occasionally have geometric anxiety attacks when we bend the rules too creatively. As for coffee, well, it's become something of a symbol throughout the galaxy. In every council building, you'll find at least one coffee maker, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the simplest things. There's even a new form, CB001 request for coffee break and creative brainstorming session. Ping still runs the archives, though now they're open to everyone. She started a collection of what she calls creative solutions that probably shouldn't have worked but did anyway. It's becoming quite extensive. And me? I'm still here, still filing paperwork in creative ways, still introducing the galaxy to human concepts they never knew they needed. Next week, I'm scheduled to explain the concept of weekend breaks to the council. I've already prepared the forms, made extra coffee, and warned the emergency response teams. Because that's the thing about humanity, we don't just think outside the box. We redesign the box, turn it into something completely different, and then file the paperwork to make it officially recognized as no longer a box. And somewhere out there on a death world called Earth, billions of humans are going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their coffee-fueled, chaos-embracing, problem-solving nature has become the galaxy's greatest asset. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to file Form CS404 Creative Solution for filing too many creative solution forms. The irony is not lost on me.